Before we continue, make sure you understand the basics of imperial government, with England at the center of its empire, which included all its colonies. England was a constitutional monarchy, which meant that the monarch was limited by the traditions of the English Constitution. He was expected to respect the rights of Parliament, England's legislative body, as well as the rights of individuals. Colonists across the empire considered themselves entitled to these cherished rights of Englishmen. At the colonial level of government was the governor, appointed by the king, and his council. Each colony had its own legislative body made up of representatives elected by the colonists. The economy of the British Empire was based on the theory of mercantilism. In simple terms, this theory stated that the world's wealth is limited and that your empire should get the biggest share possible, at the expense of other empires. France was an especially big rival. In order to do this, England needed to have a self-contained economy. With colonies producing raw goods like cotton, and England manufacturing them into finished products like textiles, for example, the empire as a whole would be less dependent on goods purchased from others and could instead export a surplus to competitors. The British put certain policies in place as a practical way of implementing the theory. In the second half of the 17th century, the Navigation Acts required goods to be transported only on English ships and to pass through English ports. In the first half of the 18th century, the Manufacturing Acts kept American colonists from exporting certain manufactured items in competition with the industries in England. The Molasses Act placed such a high tax on molasses imported from the French West Indies that it was much cheaper for colonists to buy from the British West Indies. These were all ways of keeping business within the empire for the good of the whole. This arrangement was one of mutual benefit. American colonists were privileged to be a part of the world's best economy. They had the protection of the Royal Navy, and the British government even subsidized some colonial industries to help them grow. The economy of the colonies grew even faster than England's own. Although these new policies did place some restrictions on colonists, they were not oppressive, and they left plenty room for economic growth. Colonies had wide opportunity to trade with one another. Of course, sometimes colonists broke the rules, for example, by smuggling and refusing to pay duties. How did the British officials respond? With the policy of salutary neglect, they often chose to overlook offenses. Complete enforcement would have not only been expensive, but also impossible, and they thought it best to let some offenses slide and keep good relations with the colonies. This would lead to problems later when, as we will see, England changed its policy after the French and Indian War. Now let's turn from the colonial economy to colonial ideology. First of all, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment began in Europe and spread ideas around the globe that emphasized the importance of reason and nature. Its impact was seen in the realm of science, with Newton's observations of the laws of nature, and in politics, with Locke's pragmatic approach to government as a contract for the good of the people. Enlightenment ideology also had an impact on religious ideas by promoting humanism and deism. Deists, such as Ben Franklin, believed in God's existence but saw him as a distant creator, a creator who started the world like a clockmaker starts a clock, to run on its own without supernatural involvement. Consider the following passage from Franklin's autobiography. He writes, "I was never without some religious principles. I never doubted, for instance, the existence of the deity, that he made the world and governed it by his providence, that the most acceptable service of God was the doing of good to man, that our souls are immortal, and that all crime will be punished and virtue rewarded either here or hereafter." As you can see from this quote, Franklin emphasized good citizenship in determining destiny, not sin and salvation. Thomas Jefferson was also a deist who rewrote the New Testament by removing all passages about miracles and the deity of Christ. But the Enlightenment was only one influence on the ideology of colonial America. Christianity also played an important role in shaping history. At the same time as the Enlightenment was gaining followers in America, the colonies underwent what became known as the First Great Awakening. In the 1730s, a Puritan or Congregationalist minister named Jonathan Edwards began preaching in New England about the necessity of the new birth. His famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, illustrates the basic message that sparked revivalism throughout the colonies for decades. Consider the following passage from Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends at the arrow of your heart, and strains the bow, and it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. Thus are all of you that never passed under a great change of heart, by the mighty power of the Spirit of God upon your souls, all that were never born again, and made new creatures, and raised from being dead in sin, to a state of new, and before altogether unexperienced, light and life. However you may have reformed your life in many things, and may have had religious affections, and may keep up a form of religion in your families and closets, and in the houses of God, and may be strict in it, you are thus in the hands of an angry God. It is nothing but his mere pleasure that keeps you from being this moment swallowed up in everlasting destruction. Like many, Edwards feared declension in his society. People were going through the motions of Christianity without showing evidence that they had been born again by the power of God. George Whitefield was a famous traveling evangelist who came from England to tour the colonies multiple times, preaching to large crowds. The message these men preached divided many churches, and defenders of the status quo, called Old Lights, called them New Lights. The significance of the First Great Awakening for religious history is clear. Note the widespread acceptance of Calvinism during the First Great Awakening, teaching that sinful man was spiritually dead and unable to save himself, completely dependent on the mercy of a sovereign God who was able to save whoever he chose. We'll see later that the doctrine of Arminianism, or man's free will, became popular during the Second Great Awakening. Historians debate the political significance of the First Great Awakening. Some argue that it set the stage for the Revolution against Britain's authority. Some parts of American history were influenced by a combination of Enlightenment and Christian ideology. A good example is civil millennialism. The Christian doctrine of the millennium teaches of a 1,000-year period of peace during Christ's reign on earth. But many Americans during the French and Indian War combined millennialism with their focus on worldly affairs. They saw the French enemy as the Antichrist because it was a Catholic nation with an absolute monarchy. Many saw fighting the French Empire as an opportunity to usher in the millennium, instead of waiting for God to defeat a spiritual enemy. You'll learn more about the French and Indian War in the next lecture.